All right, everyone. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming along today. So, my name's Elliot Lindsay. I'm a historian that specialises in the history of typically around East Sydney, and I run the true crime tours. So some of you might have seen advertised in these with Bad this year. Some of the tours that are going about. There's one saying King's Cross, tomorrow Woolloomooloo, which is attached to this one. So I run similar tours like that around Surrey Hills and Darlinghurst, and also write for various newspapers and articles and so on. Tanya?
I'm Tanya Bretherton. I have published 4 true crime books, all about Sydney and historical Sydney. So I've done the 20s, the 30s, the Edwardian period and the post-war period. But I am actually not a criminologist, I'm a sociologist. So my interest really is what was going on in the context, in the society around the true crime event. So that's kind of my bent.
And they're some of the best books you read. I've read many of them, most of them actually, and they're fantastic.
Thanks.
So definitely recommend you guys check them out after this talk. So folks, as you can see today, the topic, doctors who kill. And you might be looking at this and thinking, oh yeah, what's the story here? Well, we're going to reveal to you an interesting little scenario. I was speaking to Catherine, who helps organise the Crime Writers Festival, and we were discussing ideas of what we could talk about coming up, and it came up this one case, the girl in the box, which she found quite fascinating. And she recommended that could be a potential little collaboration if we did it together with Tanya.
Yep.
Tanya's books sort of cover similar topics. And of course, what happened, Tanya, when we got in touch, we started talking?
Well, the weirdest thing was that it was this generalised discussion, because there's a lot of gender that we're going to talk about today. It's a very gender-relevant crime discussion. And Catherine said to me, talk to Tanya about this case. And I said, a girl in a box? I said, I've done a huge amount of study on the girl in the box in Melbourne. So there's 2 in twin cities.
Yes, so we'll reveal to you a bit of an overview of each of our cases, respectively. But essentially, in my case, 1895, there's a girl found in the box down in Woolloomooloo Bay. So it's 1895. And yours?
1898.
And it's pretty much the same thing, right? Girl found the box.
Yep, girl found in the box. Mine was floating down the Yarra River. So she'd been submerged, weighted, and the box had re-emerged, which is a lovely thought in of itself in summer, and was floating down the Yarra River when she was discovered.
Yeah, so in the case, and I'll do a quick overview of my case, and then Tanya, you can go in a bit more detail on yours. Good. And what we'll do is we'll sort of discuss some of the comparisons, some of the things we found that were quite unique. Similar things that we found, little interesting comparison notes that we noticed that really reflected a lot on the time period, especially how women were treated in that period of time. So we'll start with the Woolloomooloo case. Woolloomooloo obviously being just down the road from where we are now. On the 1st of September in 1895, it was approximately 10 p.m. at night on a road called Duke Street. Duke Street. Now, Duke Street doesn't exist anymore. It's not called Duke anyway. It's called McElhone Street. McElhone runs along Brougham. It's there's the sandstone escarpment that separates Woolloomooloo from King's Cross. That's essentially what Duke Street or McElhone ran along. And at 10 o'clock that night, a horse and cart was spotted, a very dark, ominous-looking horse with a carriage. And on this carriage was a box, just one single box. Now, in 1895, Woolloomooloo looked a lot of different to what it does today. A lot more cottages, a lot more factories and warehouses, workshops. The wharves look different. The Navy wasn't there for starters. The Navy comes later, just after World War II. So in those days, a lot of shipyards on that eastern side. The horse and cart comes down. The intention is to ride onto the wharves, right to the water's edge, and the individual was planning to hop out and throw this box into the water. But unfortunately, they just commenced doing a complete renovation of Woolloomooloo with the intention of building what was today become the Cowper Street Wharves. And it's gated off. So the driver stops, unloads the box just there on the spot, and rides away. The watchman happens to be around, and a few hours later, the watchman comes and finds this box sitting there. It's unlabeled. Now, there's a lot of boxes going to be around these areas. It's a shipping area, so it's quite common, but this one's unlabeled. He notices there's a weird smell coming out of it. There's a weird odor. The odor smells of decaying flesh, but also of chemicals. He gets a crowbar, he rips it open, and what does he find inside? Something which is one of the most horrible sights that anyone would ever hope never to see, and that was the body of a young woman in her early 20s, red hair. She was nude from the waist down. She was wearing a light blouse that was soaked in blood. But what was most alarming about it to this man, what he found was that there was an incision going down the abdomen, down the stomach, and had been stitched up crudely. So this man panics, he runs and gets the police. Now the police come and they commence an investigation, of course, to determine who this person is and what happened to him. When the press finds out, immediately the press goes to sensationalism mode. 1895, it's only a few years after the last Whitechapel murder. The last Whitechapel murder in London is 1891, officially. Some argue that there's been others since. There's always speculation where Jack the Ripper had gone afterwards. So the newspapers, they headlined, Jack the Ripper in Sydney. It's a huge story. They do a post-mortem, the coroner does a post-mortem of the body, and it determines that this poor woman had died from what we'd say is a botched abortion. Someone had cut open the stomach, ripped open the womb, and had removed the fetus. And I saw a little trigger warning I should have given about some of the content of this topic, but it is, this is sort of what happens. And now ultimately it's quickly dispelled, this myth of Jack the Ripper. Those at the time realised pretty soon who they believed this person was responsible. They identified the woman as Jessie Nichols. Jessie Nichols was 23 years old. She was from a wealthy landowning family that was based in Mulgrave, out in western, where's that, approximately Penrith way?
Yeah, I think so.
And the poor girl had come out to get an abortion out of shame when she was impregnated by her boyfriend. Now, police realised that there was a candidate straight away, a suspect, I should say, straight away, immediately, who came to their attention, who came to mind. And this was an individual who had only just been released from prison about 3 years earlier. They'd been keeping an eye on him. His name was Dr. Sheridan, Dr. Thomas Meredith Sheridan. And Dr. Sheridan was a man that had been just come out of prison for a horrible crime. See, in 1884, he was responsible for the death of 5 women in a period of 3 months. 3 of them died in the same day. He was what you'd say a quack or a charlatan doctor. He was based on Park Street, and he would put up advertisements in the newspaper in cryptic language to get the attention of young women who were in trouble, who might have been recently made pregnant or whatever other reason. And this is how he'd lure them in, using these cryptic little ads. And in a period in September 1884 to November, he's responsible for the death of 5 women. And it's quite tragic how they happen, because they're all very similar. The deaths are caused by, essentially, they would go to him, they would try to buy some potions, some medicines, flushes, various other different procedures which he would advertise. And in all 5 cases, and I think we're going to find that this was a similarity with your case, Tanya, these potions failed. And of course, they go walk away sick. It's a big issue there. So what does he do? He comes in, he does a procedure to induce a miscarriage sooner. And in this case, it was to perforate the uterus. And what happens with all 5 girls is they get infected and they all die. And it's not a nice way to go, I can assure you. And unfortunately, in the case of these women, although the coroners, when they finally revealed all these people who they were, over a period of this 3 months, it became apparent to the police. They arrested Thomas Sheridan. He stands in the coroner's courts. The coroner recommends that he be charged on willful murder. Okay, willful murder, not for procure of abortion, willful murder. We should make this very clear. And the Attorney General agrees, but when it comes time to prosecution, in the trial, they don't go down the path of willful murder. Instead, they go down they try to charge him on procuring an abortion on 2 of the cases. 3 of the girls the charges are dismissed. They throw him out. They don't even pursue the trial. 2 of them they do, and they manage to successfully have him prosecuted, and he's found guilty of procuring an abortion, and he's sentenced to 10 years in prison. And it's but he doesn't serve the 10, he serves 7.5. So of course he soon comes out, approximately just before about 1893, and immediately he's allowed to return. And when I say allowed, I'm not saying he's promoted to do this, but there's nothing stopping him from going straight back to his old way, straight back to his old practice. And of course, it ends in tragedy for poor Jesse Nichols. So, Tanya.
Yeah, I might talk a little bit about, so you've got kind of a lot of cases that are swirling around one person. The woman in the box case in Melbourne is just one woman. A similar kind of story to yours. 3 boys are out in a rowboat in the Yarra River, middle of the day, early December. So it's quite warm, they're enjoying the warm weather, and they see a boot box. So those big boxes that sat on the back of horse and carriage. So not boot as in boot, but boot boxes that sat on the back of the horse and carriage apparatus. So it's quite a big box. They see this thing floating down the Yarra River. It's working class Richmond. So the boys are like, if we can salvage that, clean it up, we'll be able to sell it back to one of the transport cab companies. So they row over, pull this thing into the boat, and of course, as soon as they pull it in, the end is completely rotten, and what spills out is the foulest smell that you could ever imagine, and a human foot. And similar to your case, so of course, they rowed ashore, the police are called. The girl is naked. She's young. They estimate that she's maybe about 20, but they faced a tricky situation because no identifying marks. Her hair's been cut as well. So it looks like there's been an effort to kind of change her appearance, but they're not sure. No one can work out who this girl is. So no young women have been reported missing in the area. So they take the extraordinary step of displaying the young woman's body, who was already quite decomposed. They display her body in the morgue for a month in summer in Melbourne with no refrigeration. Thousands of people parade through to have a look at this one. No one knows who this girl is. The police secretly suspect, just because of the pattern of the way woman is disposed of, she's naked, she hadn't been surgically, it wasn't clear that she'd undergone a surgical procedure, but they suspected that she was probably the victim of a botched abortion. So 1,500 people in one day go past this girl. No one will own up to knowing her anyway. At the end of it, the end of the month, more than 5,000 people went through Melbourne morgue to try and identify this girl. Very slowly, to kind of make a longer story short, the girl is identified, and her name's Mabel Ambrose Discartia. She's an inner city girl, and she was indeed the victim of a botched abortion. So I don't know whether or not I go into the details now of what happened. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
I assume probably the same way that the investigation was undertaken in your case. The autopsy provides some really important details. So young Mabel, she was 17. She died of, she had sepsis, which is an awful way to go, but she'd also been beaten as well. So they'd crushed her body in order to force her into the box. Witness statements, in addition to the autopsy, were a really important part of forming a case or a picture of what happened. Mabel was a wayward girl, as they called it, an uncontrollable girl. They like that phrase as well. And she had been seeing a young real estate agent who was the person that came to collect, in fact, her mother's rent. So she'd been having an illicit affair out of wedlock, which was a shock, scandal, terrible thing at the time. And she became pregnant. And Travis Todd, the young real estate agent, who was a very popular young man, he was 20, a local cricketer, local footballer, very popular young man. He knew all of the local tenancies. So he was aware that in one of the nearby streets, there was a woman called Olga Radoliski, who actually ran, in addition to, she was kind of like, it was the early gig economy. Yeah. So she was a palmist, she was a futurist, she told fortunes, she was a masseuse, but she was also an abortionist. So in fact, it was the boyfriend that connected Mabel Ambrose up with the solution to their problem. And a little bit different to your, and I really want to get into this because I think the details of your Dr. Sheridan, I think, are fascinating. Mabel Ambrose went through a number of different attempts in order to try and miscarry her child. They electrocuted her. They called it a galvanized battery, but it was basically a primitive battery that had tubing attached to it, and that was inserted in her body, and this went on for over 2 weeks. So they basically submitted her to electric shocks. But she also went through, I suppose, in general terms, what we think of as being the coat hanger abortion. That's a bad word to use, but she was also submitted to one of those abortion procedures. And because Olga was a practicing abortionist, she'd actually acquired some of the medical instruments that were used by some of the local doctors. So she had a curette, kind of a long, thin metal, heavy handle with sort of a hoop on the end. She'd also attempted to procure an abortion in that way, and it had failed. And she'd also perforated poor Mabel's bowel at the same time. So I'm sorry, I probably should have given a bit of a warning about how graphic some of this is. She'd also tried, again, because of connections with doctors, this clandestine world of the abortion network. They would procure stuff from the hospitals and the doctors. She'd also fed her ergot, which is like a fungus. They grow it on rye, on grain, and they'd attempted to get her to drink that. And they used it in the hospitals at the time because it accelerated contractions. So it was to speed up. That failed as well. So there were a range of different, I think they tried to overheat her as well. They would often try and overheat the woman's body. That had also failed.
It's very interesting because in the case of Dr. Sheridan and the various girls which he had administered his practice over and who passed away, it's the same procedures. Yeah. And it seems that period of time in that late 1890s, the end of the 19th century, these weird and wonderful sort of contraptions and all this are being introduced. Galvanic shock is for one. There was a lady, one of the 5 women in 1884, her name was Ada Hughes, and she too was given the electric shock therapy and what they called galvanic shock for 5 days, which was very much unsuccessful. But one thing, just talking about this, we have some similarities in this, which I wanted to talk about, and it gives a bit of an insight into the way the law and society looked at these cases. Because had these been considered straight up murder cases, if this Thomas Sheridan had just gone and poisoned people out of his way or stabbed someone with a knife, it would be the path that could have taken, these trials would have taken and these cases would have taken would have been completely different, in my opinion. Yeah. And I think maybe you might agree with me in some ways, Tanya. And a lot of it is the way society and when the law, the police and the press deemed the character of the poor females who were the victims. Now, a prime example of where we can see a direct result of this is in the case of one young lady in 1884, her name was Sarah Hales. Sarah Hales was one of the girls who they actually managed to prosecute ultimately and find Sheridan guilty of procuring abortion for, and which he goes to jail. The doctor surgically removes her uterus and takes it to court and presents it as evidence. And in the case of Mabel...
Yeah, in Mabel Ambrose's case, look, there's a number of elements actually that I'd love to pick up on. Mabel, absolutely. The victim was seen as being basically part of the problem. And Travis Todd, her boyfriend, and Olga, the woman who had kind of submitted her, committed all these procedures on her, both of those people were charged, but because Mabel was seen as being a willing participant in what had happened, the law was a lot lighter, I think, viewed what they did a lot more. It was more about the issue of it being defined as murder. I think the degree of stigma and the degree of... there was much more emphasis on making this a moral case.
Yes.
They wanted to make an example of these people. And even though Travis Todd had been the one that had kind of facilitated it as the boyfriend, he ultimately only got 6 years for what had happened, even though he'd been heavily involved. In fact, he was the one that had dumped Mabel's body. He'd stomped Mabel into the box in order to dispose of her body. But because he was seen as being a young man with a promising career, a popular local cricketer, he was viewed very, very differently to the women involved.
Yeah. And also in the case with Mabel, when they were trying to identify her and they put her...
Yes, they
did. Her head and they put it into a jar of alcohol, correct?
So they left... So she was in the morgue for a long period of time before anyone could identify her in summer. So her body had started to rot, that it was unbearable, which says something really, that if it took a month for them to... I can only imagine what it was like leading up to that month. So they severed her body from her head and put her head in like a bell jar of alcohol, pretty much, a big jar of alcohol, and then proceeded to leave her head in the morgue, and people wheeled past that. There's actually photos of it on the internet, if that's...
And in light of her being considered wayward, Sarah Hales, it's revealed during the investigation, was they would term a common prostitute. So she's a sex worker.
Yeah.
And the woman who she was living with at the time, who came across in the coroner's report, coronal inquest as being the sort of maidenly, older lady, and she was like a sort of caring type. Yeah. But in the trials, they completely destroy her character. They make her out that she's living off the immoral earnings of poor Sarah. But when I looked at our two cases, first thing I thought was, one's considered, is a prostitute, and yours is wayward.
Yep.
Hers, they mutilate the body and they put it on display. With Sarah, they do the same thing. They bring the uterus on display. And I question, based especially on the press, the way the press dealt with it, some were outraged. Yeah. How could they do this? Would they have done something like that to a woman that they considered to be of a higher standing in society?
Yeah.
Because I'm of the impression and the opinion that they probably would not have.
No, of course. No.
But of course, because of the way they saw they stood in society, they could do these things. Now, sure, it helped them solve the crime, but at the end of the day, would they have done it otherwise?
And a lot of this too, there's an argument that you could put that a lot of this is about sanctioning and shaping women and immoral wayward behaviour, because in the Melbourne case, witnesses very important in a case like this, One of the women who was living in the house with Olga, who was also a sex worker, Olga was an abortionist and a sex worker. She, in fact, worked with the police, joined the Salvation Army, started going to church, a woman called Thekla de Burke, and she, in fact, was a key witness for the state and effectively turned on the people that Olga had taken her in. But it was all about reshaping and sanctioning women's behaviour. So if Thecla's now going to look, she's seen the error of her ways, we can believe everything that she says. So a lot of her testimony is what this was based on.
Yeah, interesting. And on the note of witnesses, that's another problem which we've come across, we found.
Yeah.
That in that time period, firstly, talking about abortions was just, you wouldn't talk about this stuff. It was obviously a bit of a taboo subject, and even in the press, they always reveal, they dance around terms.
Yeah.
And of course, when it came to getting people who would witnesses who would come forward and testify, we find that there's a lot of silence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've had, in your case, I know certainly there was a lot of that. People wouldn't talk about it or wouldn't come forward.
The thing that interests me about the Melbourne case as well, you've got Olga, who is, as far as the state's concerned, is conducting the abortions. She's living with Thecla, who was also assisting. But there's also a doctor off to the side in the Melbourne case as well. And he clearly had been providing the instruments in order for Olga to be able to perform the abortions, and in fact may have been involved in undertaking some of the procedures himself. But because man of higher status, the state used him. He was basically a state's witness, and he got off scot-free. And it's very clear that he was much more involved in what was going on than anyone was going to admit.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up, because in the case which I mentioned before of Sarah Hales, who dies in the 16th of November 1884, and it was eventually proven that it was caused by Dr. Sheridan and his assistant. In this case, she was living with the woman named Mrs. Billiard, who was in the trial. They accused of living off Sarah Hale's immoral gains. And in the trial, the assistant of Thomas Sheridan, who's also essentially, he's facing willful murder charges as well, tries to turn the entire story around and say, well, how do we not know that this Mrs. Billiard didn't commit the abortion?
Yeah.
And that she's just trying to blame us, who have a good reputation. But obviously, she's the one who's immoral. She's got, she's essentially, what would you say, like a madam or a pimp or something like that. And it's interesting they went down that path as well.
The bus was coming and they got thrown under it.
Exactly.
That's for sure.
Yeah, which is very, very common.
I had a question, and I hope I'm not preempting anyone else's questions but the case of Sheridan does fascinate me, because although there was a degree of some similarities we've talked about, a degree of experimentation in trying to get women to miscarry, Sheridan, to me, it reads different to a lot of the other abortion cases that I've read. Sepsis, very common as a form of death for these women, a horrible way to go. I have never actually come across a case where, in order to achieve an abortion, the woman had been surgically cut, the fetus had been cut away, and they'd restitched it back. I have never heard of that before, which part of me, it does trip in me, this idea, maybe this is a little bit more Jack the Ripper going on here.
So to get into that, we have to look at the whole case from 1884 to 1895. So he spends 7 years in jail. So there's that gap in between. So ultimately, when you look at his case, he commits these within a period of about a month. 4 women die. Okay, now this is an incredible stat if you think about it. You think if you made one mistake, you wouldn't keep repeating them over and over again.
He's either the worst abortionist that has ever existed, or there is another motive that's in play.
What's brought up in the trial. In the trial of Sarah Hales, they he actually stands up and he says in his defense, listen, I've been a trained surgeon and trained doctor. He allegedly learnt on the battlefields of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. He says, I've been a trained doctor for 15 years. I live in a beautiful mansion in the city. I earn, was it £1,600 a year? Now, just so you understand today's money, it's about $500,000, $600,000. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And he says to the court, to the jury, why would I risk my freedom, he mentions his wife's happiness and his own livelihood for a few poxy pounds? This is how he puts it. And if you were to look at that, you'd think, well, yeah, it's a good point. But that's his defense. You know, I wouldn't have, it's not something I would do. I have a reason not to. That's my reason. That's my defense. But you can also turn that around and say, well, yeah, good question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why did you?
Yeah.
Because if you're making that much money, he only charged £1, £2 for these procedures. That's a real drop in the ocean for a lot of risk.
Yeah.
So there's your first problem. He does that. Now he gets put into jail. The judge makes it very clear. I should make it clear for one of the ladies named Ellen Bell. He says, look, judges like to go fire and brimstone when they hand down their sentence. And he goes real fire and brimstone. He says, look, this is the maximum sentence I can give you, and I think it's a minimum sentence I really should be giving you. I'm so disappointed that death by abortion is not a capital crime. Otherwise, I'd be hanging you. But I'll give you this 10 years. The next case, it's another 10. They run consecutive terms. When he finally comes out, the immediate thing he does is he goes straight to being a doctor again.
Yeah.
He starts off as, it's almost like he has this addiction and he can't control himself.
Yeah.
He starts as a dentist. Then he starts dealing in chemicals and potions for impotency for men. Then and it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and then finally he can't resist women's problems.
Yeah.
And the ads. Look, there's this is an example of one of the ads, which he it's sorry if you won't be able to read it, but you can see this is an example of the type of ad which you'd have in the newspapers.
Yeah.
Which would say, you know, essentially to young women to come in and use a very cryptic language about women only and all this type of stuff. Immediately he goes straight back into it, and this time when he operates, it's, as you said, it's so
there's
gruesome.
Just something strange about it, because there's a clandestine world within the era of abortion in the late 19th century, and actually even into the 20th century. There were definitely some tried and true methods. And borrowing a lot of surgical instrumentation in, using obstetric forceps, that sort of stuff. But there was always a similar pattern to them, which basically involved sorry to put it, but you either went up or you went down. So it was about women trying to swallow something. I've never seen a surgical intervention like that. Sorry, but it is striking. And
at first, when in the trial of the Jessie Nichols case, which is the one they find her in the box in Woolloomooloo, he puts forward, when it's finally all come out, he's got nurses, of course. This is another issue which comes up. A lot of the time the doctor would do the work, he'd commit the crime, he would leave, the nurse has to deal with the poor patient for a few days, and then she would then be thrown under the bus with it. And in this case, they were arguing, the doctor had to do the essentially open up the stomach afterwards to see where he went wrong after she died. But then the question is, why restitch it if you're going to put the person in a box and dump it in the harbour?
Why would you do it?
So to me, I think, really we can get straight to the point and say it looks like this man was some sort of essentially, I think, a serial killer.
Yeah.
And
there's something very strange going on.
And the question is, how many other people were there out there who were never discovered? And I'll give you an example why. Ada Hughes is the first case in September 1884. When she dies, she's the one who gets the electrogalvanic shock. When she passes away, they're very cunning in how they worked, Sheridan and his team. They got out of the scene. They then had another doctor, unsuspecting, come and review and see the girl. And they said, oh yes, Ada Hughes, to do a death certificate, died of dropsy and heart disease. Have you come across this one, heart disease?
Right.
Heart disease, dying of heart disease was something I put forward a lot when it came to these cases.
Yeah.
And of course, what they do is they bury her. This is in the North Shore. It's in Milson's Point. Milson's Point, approximately where the bridge stands today. Rumours starting to go around, right? Rumours. And as a result, when the rumours start to come out, the word gets out that this has taken place, and they have to go back and they dig her up, and they determine what's taken place. And you suddenly realise, if it wasn't for the rumours, or in another case, anonymous letters received, you get this as well, anonymous letters, how many more might have gone unnoticed?
Yeah.
Because, again, no one likes to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really wenched out of them.
I'm interested to know, and this may not be something that you know the answer to, but are you, in your history tours, is because this was such a clandestine world, do you know where some of the sites were of the kind of because they were always private residences, weren't they?
There's in the press, you get stories that will occasionally come on.
Right.
And I'm sure you've probably seen them across in your
in fact, where Olga Radulski conducted her business, both as a sex worker but also as an abortionist. So the abortions happened up on the top floor, and the sex work happened on the ground floor. But the house is still there.
House is still there. Yeah, it's interesting that look, there was another case that did come up, which is very similar, and just to give you an idea of how it still goes into the 20th century. So we're talking about the late 19th century here. There was a case called the Glebe Bones. I don't know if some people might have come across it before. It's in 1922, a woman named Gertrude Mabel Hayden. And essentially what takes place is there's a letter, again, anonymous letter, because, again, people don't want to come forward a lot of the time. There's this stigma around this type of stuff. So that pen anonymous letters. An anonymous letter goes to the police station, New South Wales, in Sydney, in the Sydney Central Police Station, and it says, on this date, at approximately this area, a horse and cart's going to be riding down the road with a box on the back, and inside is going to be a body, and it's going to be buried under a shack in Redfern. And as a result, it's a huge thing, and they start looking for everything, and they look for the body, and ultimately they do find it. It is buried under a shack, but not in Redfern, in Glebe. Yeah. And that's on Westmoreland Lane in Glebe. So you sometimes get them coming up when they're very much sensationalized stories. Yeah. But more so in my case, because my tours go around the women's, the Crown Street Women's Hospital and St Margaret's, it's more about children have been dumped in alleys and stuff like that. We get a lot more of that type of thing.
But they were notoriously difficult cases to prosecute because for as much as we've got women that were discovered and it was linked, there was an outcome. Yes. In terms of it was linked to. There are hundreds and hundreds of cases in both Sydney and Melbourne where women were left or disposed of. No one is going to come forward. It really was. A lot of it was anonymous tip-offs.
Very much so.
Because you're not going to come forward because you're implicated. The police are not sympathetic at all to your situation in terms of, even if it's going to aid their case in a lot of circumstances, because they'll just go, you're as bad as them, you're done.
This was quite common. If a nurse was to have felt sorry for the woman and she thought she wanted to report it, of course she would be thrown into it. But you talk about the difficulty of prosecuting. Let's quickly just touch on that, because in these cases, and I'm not exactly sure. Maybe you can elaborate on how yours went. But in the case of in the 1880s, in the cases when they were trying to charge Sheridan for the murder of the 5 women, one of the issues was with the Sarah Hale case is the jury will not agree. They will not agree. And there's a lot of them. And what they would say was, and the press was a big problem with the press with this, was this person didn't commit murder because the participant, the victim, was a willing participant. Yeah. The victim came, how was this murder? And this was common. Yeah. And they had to dismiss several juries in some of these cases because of that and refer it to the Attorney General to have it approved and move forward. And even in the trial of Sarah Hale, if it wasn't for the fact they had brought in this such a macabre bit of evidence, the jury again was
similar situation in Melbourne. Olga Radulski, the abortionist, and Travis Todd, they were the 2 people that were charged in Mabel Ambrose's murder. A lot of the language was around. Initially, they got a capital sentence, largely because it was mandatory. So it was labelled murder. Yep. But a lot of the language around the trial was Mabel Ambrose was there of her own free will, participating in this. She was a difficult, wayward. This kid had been trouble for years, so the police knew about her. Her mother can't control her, all that sort of language. And we don't think that they intended to kill her. So Olga, so they both initially got a capital sentence, but it was commuted to time in jail. Olga got 10 years and Travis Todd got 6 years. Right, so they both served their sentences and then were out and living in the community again.
Well, Sheridan, I'm happy to say, in 1895, when he's finally brought to justice, and as I said before, the police immediately knew, and when they finally got him, they got the evidence, they put the case together, he went to trial, he was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging in Darlinghurst Prison. In 1896, he was hanged. Now, there's the hangman was actually Robert Howard, Nosy Bob. There's actually a talk about what we're going to talk. I think it's Saturday, so if you want to learn more about him, by all means, go and do that one. So he was finally hanged. But again, the press still, there was a big debate. Should he have been? And even in this case, in 1922, I found in the newspaper a full-page spread going back in time talking about this case. And this man had actually, Sheridan had wrote a manifesto just before he died. And even to
that can't be good.
Even to the very end, it was crazy because he never would admit guilt. He would never say he did anything wrong. He always said that he was, I've had hundreds and hundreds of patients who owe me their lives, which is obviously not nice, owing lives and stuff like that. And he writes his full manifesto. And he essentially, the weird thing is, and this also goes to the path of, is this more than just misadventure? Yeah. Is this, all out murder? Is he starts talking all this Masonic stuff about, I did this, under the blessing of God and all those type of things. And he's essentially penning this up within hours of his own, like within the days and hours leading up to his hanging in Darlinghurst. So,
and he had a family and children.
He had a family and children. He was only 42, and it's quite an incredible situation. But yeah, so
he didn't spend any time in England, did he? I mean, is it? Am I making a really big leap to say? Is there any chance that he could have been the Ripper? No, the timeline doesn't line up.
No, because he went to jail in 85.
Oh, okay. And I'm not as familiar, with the Ripper cases.
No, he didn't go. No, he wouldn't have got. No, so I know.
Yeah, but it does.
Oh, and that's another thing. It's very interesting to see how immediately when the press picked up on poor old Jesse Nichols' body being found, they immediately Jack the Ripper strikes. Yeah. And it's quite confronting when you see this thing because there's a lot of hysteria around all this. But one interesting also with your case, Tanya, with Mabel, it takes place in 1898.
Yep.
This takes place in 1895. He's hanged in 1896. One's in a box, but she's left in her normal condition, so she's not. She has no changes.
Yeah.
The fool that drops them off just leaves them at the door, and of course, witnesses say, in the case of Jesse Nichols, her mother and essentially her boyfriend come and they say, look, we knew that she was going to go and see this doctor. They've managed to identify him, and it was all undone. And I've often wondered when reading your material about your one, whether this was reported heavily in Melbourne. A lot of these cases were reported all over the country.
It does make you wonder.
And I wonder if they'd actually, Olga and Travis had remember reading these articles, these cases and thinking...
somewhere the seed of the idea was sown.
Yeah, we don't want to be that same person. Let's disguise this woman, make sure...
They had, because they cut her hair. I think there was the suggestion that they were going to punch one of her teeth out to try and change her... and obviously stripped her completely, because not wearing anything, it actually was a really important part of identifying people.
Yeah, very much
because
so.
People would say, I've seen those boots. I know that woman. I've seen that, hat. So yeah, she was completely naked. So there had been an attempt to cover up what they've done, and they also attempted to sink
it this
the
time.
box
Yeah,
with a
we're
huge
not that
stone,
successful, yeah.
and of course it floated to the
It's interesting, all
surface.
these people. Roger Rogerson's another one, a bunch of them. They don't seem to be able to sink bodies, do they? But anyway, that's another story. How are we going for time at the moment? Okay, cool, excellent.
Yeah, if anyone
wants to, while we're still, and then we can continue a bit
sure.
more afterwards while we're doing it. Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your research and your talk today. It was really interesting. It occurs to me, though, possibly the reason why he wasn't charged in the first instance with murder was the Crown was never going to succeed with a murder charge, because in order to prove a murder charge, they have to prove that either he intended to kill the woman or he had a reasonable apprehension that what he was doing would have killed her.
Yes.
And as you said a minute ago, he argues that he's been doing this for years successfully and hasn't killed anybody. So the first time it wouldn't have stuck. The second time it stuck because he knew that that was a likely outcome, because that's what happened the first, in the earlier case. Yeah. So it's one possible explanation.
Yeah.
An interesting little thing on that. In 1883, they'd done a amendment to the criminal law. So they did the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and they actually made a new clause on a death clause. And it was about reckless indifference to life. And what they did was they said reckless indifference to life is considered murder. And originally, when the coroner and the Attorney General and the police courts, the Central Police Courts magistrate there finds him guilty of willful murder, it is based on that idea of reckless indifference to life. But just as you said, it's all good saying this person murdered something. And this is what you find time and time again with every single murder case. And we see it all the time in modern ones and the past.
Yeah.
You have to be able to actually, as you said, prove to a jury that, beyond reasonable doubt, that this person actually was willfully trying to commit murder. And that's obviously a difficult thing to do. So you're 100% correct. Yeah. Was it easier to charge them for procuring an abortion? Yes. Why didn't they pursue the other 3 cases and make it more solid? Well, they'd had their man. They got their man.
Yeah.
And that makes, it costs a lot of money to take people to trial, costs a lot of time. So that's how they used to look at it. Plus the resources were very, scarce in those times. So I can understand why they did probably go down that path. So you're probably correct there. So. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'll come next.
Thanks for that. You said that the doctor was very wealthy and had a big medical practice. So was it the case that he in fact treated a lot of people for other things that had successful outcomes? And you would wonder, if he was a good doctor in that aspect, why then was he so incompetent with the women?
Well, here's the thing though. What was he doing? If you look at the type of work that he would have been doing is working on teeth. So, you're administering opium and stuff like that. Potions, which really, a lot of the cases you'd find like male impotence, right? How are you going to prove that this man failed? You have to stand up in front of a magistrate and say, I took his things and now I can't, it didn't make me, I'm no more of a man than I was before I drank his serum. Yeah. So it's one of these things where they deal in little niche areas where they knew they'd never really get caught. Abortion's one of them because the stigma against it's high. And of course, it's you trying to keep it quiet, there's all these homes and places for women when they got pregnant to go and disappear. Yeah. It sort of fits into that world. So I think that's a bit of it there. But when we talk about he ran a successful practice, he called that practice in 1890s when he comes out, the British Medical Institute. And it was based on it's based at 26 Elizabeth Street. And you should all know that location because that's the Channel 7 studios.
I was going to say that, yeah.
So Channel 7 sits above where essentially he was operating on a lot of these. That's where the young girl Nichols died. No, exactly that spot.
Do we know he was actually a doctor? Because you know how a lot of people people got away with practicing as doctors without having ever studied.
So he wasn't. It appears it's hard to say because some sources say he was.
Yeah, okay.
Some say he wasn't. He says he was. He never says I was studied at Oxford or Sydney University.
Yeah, because that's the thing. They often went overseas.
Yes.
So they would study in England, different era. You can't just look it up on the Google machine. You know, there was no way, in many cases, there wasn't any way of verifying it without a lot of police work.
Well, that's right. And the fact that he said, oh, yes, I served in the Franco-Prussian War, you know, and I was on the medical team of, what's his name, the big Prussian chancellor at the time. You know, and this is like an area of legitimacy. Oh, he's from Europe.
Yeah.
Was he truly a doctor? Well, I think not. I don't think so. I think he was just a chemist from everything I've read, in which case he was, you know. But this is the big issue. And a lot of doctors, legit doctors, who studied at, you know, Sydney University, let's say, or in Oxford, or practicing at Macquarie Street, came forward and said, this is outrageous. Why aren't we regulating this?
Yeah.
And that's the thing. There was no regulation.
Yeah.
That's another issue. Well, there was no regulation. If an ad like the one saying, we want, you know, young women to come in and we'll solve your problems and blockages and all this stuff today in the press, it'd be a major ordeal. But in those days, you could get away with it.
Yeah.
There was a question down the front here before. Did you still have
Sorry.
one? Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. So the British Medical Institute.
That is literally just around the corner from here.
Yeah, it's just literally you could walk down and have a look at it now. It's quite amazing. And that's where he did it all from. Yeah. This is common. You see this type of stuff a lot. This is real, you know, this is snake oil. This is like, you know, we talk about snake oil sales and quackery. It's essentially that.
And interesting, if he was a bit of a snake oil merchant, he's positioned himself, you know how Macquarie Street, for as long as anyone can remember, it was always Medical Street.
Yes.
Macquarie Street was always where the big end of town doctors were located. So what he's done is strategically positioned himself not far from there.
Well, it's like they say off Broadway, right? This is off Medical.
This is off Macquarie Street.
Right? He's not. It's second tier. It's not quite, but it's good enough, you know. And of course, if you're coming in from the country, with an ailment, then that's where you're going to obviously go and be discreet. Yes.
That's heartbreaking. Your story about what happened. Was it Jessie that she went to get an abortion, and then her mother
So in this case, ultimately what happens is, with Jessie, who's found in 1895, she is a wealthy young lady. She gets pregnant with her boyfriend at the time. He proposes to her. So this is not like the other girls. It's a bit different. They were sort of, it was just the guy runs away or whatever, but this was different. But his father was another wealthy landowner who didn't really think was a right match. And he said, if you marry that woman, I'm going to disinherit you. Now, he actually rebelled and said, no, I don't care. But Jessie was she felt so ashamed that she caused this trouble for him that she decided to leave to the city. Now, they begged her not to, but she snuck away in the middle of the night. And the reason why she didn't have any clothes is because the family took her clothes in the hope that if she didn't have clothes, she wouldn't leave. And she ran away. Now, the mother and the boyfriend follow her. And the boyfriend even says, if I was to find her right now, I'd take her to St. Mary's Cathedral and we'd marry her on the spot. So it was. So it's not. So it's important to point out in this case that, and it could be another reason why in this case, it does go down a different path. It's a bit more. There's a lot more respect for her because she's considered a more a person higher in society. Yeah. And it's a bit of a different story. It's not a fallen woman. It's a woman who there's a possibility for redemption, and it's quite easily to be seen. Yes. So
very
it's
sad.
Yeah. Folks, any other?
Oh, sorry. Actually, there's nothing on the screen at all. No. Okay. All right. Well, very good.
No. Okay, folks. There we go. Well, I don't know. What else is there? What can we?
I don't know. There's no one's got any other questions. No.
There we go. Very good. Sure.
Yeah.
So, Tanya, I read some of your books, but Elliot, do you have your book here out there, or do you have any books?
No, not presently. So the next one you guys come to, you'll see my book coming out, which will be well and truly in this sort of range of area, talking about crimes that kicked off after the 1890 Depression. to how East Sydney changes dramatically after the 89 depression. And that will be, so next time, the next bad crime ride, bad Sydney, that should be on the desk for you. But of course, Tanya's is well and truly there, which is very good. Tanya, how would you say that this current case you're working on, is there any other similarities to some of the other stories that you've come across in your book? I know in the Killing Streets, you have, of course, there's a lot, some of those characters, the young women are considered wayward or sex workers. And of course,
absolutely.
In one particular case, I know they're treated quite, they're not really respected in the press and by the police. So there are some similar
absolutely, there are.
course.
It just occurred to me then, I think I spend far too much time looking at bodies that have been left across Sydney and across city locations. One thing that did, and I'm sorry I haven't really answered your question, but one thing I did, when you do these inner city tours, you could do an entire tour just of Belmore Park, just off Central Station. The discoveries that have been made there over the years, there's some bad energy, I think, in that place.
Belmore Park, which is next to Central Station for everyone, and this is
you could do a tour just of there.
Belmore Park, Prince Alfred, of course, as well. Certainly. And one thing, folks, I don't know if anyone's coming to do the Woolloomooloo tour, which is tomorrow. And that scene, we actually go down to Duke Street or McKellen Street, which is what it's called today, and investigate the scene where the box is found, and we go through a bit of the details and have a look at the stuff there. It's also an interesting little thing to see how the area's changed over time, and especially with the naval base. Essentially, we go down to a cafe. What's it called? Cafe de Wheels. Yeah, that's essentially the spot which we sort of linger around. And of course, there's a lot more to it. But yeah, that's.
It's horrible, isn't it? The way in which people were just discarded. It's just tragic. Even in your case, and I know, sorry, we're just about to run out of time, but the mere fact that they were trying to find access to the water, so they were going to throw poor Jessie into the bay.
Yes.
And so they just dump her on the street.
Yeah, and of course it shows the incompetence in a lot of these people as well, which also goes back to Dr. Sheridan's, how good of a doctor can he be if he's making all these errors all the time?
Yeah.
And the whole bumbling of even when he was finally caught and sprung in the 1884 cases, he would quickly, he would go up to the anyone involved and say, try to stand over them and say, look, don't speak to any police, don't talk to other doctors, don't get the coroner involved. If we keep this between us, we'll be able to bury it. And of course, this goes back to the whole stigma around this stuff. And a lot of the time, people probably would have done that. In the case which I talked about before, 1922, with the girl who's discovered, the bones in Glebe.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, you find the husbands or boyfriends who are implicit with this. You'd think, why don't you, you've just lost someone you love. Why don't you go forward and do something, report it, man up and actually take, responsibility.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, it's almost like they'd go quiet. They wouldn't say anything, and and in the court cases and in the coronial inquest, if they got caught, it's weird. It's almost like there was an indifference. In the case of one of these poor girls who dies, I think it was Sarah Jane Wright, who was one of the girls in 1884. Her husband and her, so they were, and this is the case where she wasn't a single woman. She was married, but they were what they call Malthusians. Now, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with this term.
I remember learning about it at school.
Exactly. Malthusian principle of economics being that the population growth, you have exponential population growth, and the population can only grow at the rate that there's resources to support it. The moment the population expansion outweighs the amount of resources you have a population collapse.
Yeah.
This was a movement called the secularist movement, which took place in the 1870s and 80s. And her husband was very much an adherent to that, very much so. And he was very vocal about it. It was considered radical in the press at the time. So when he was determined, both of them, he and Sarah, that they weren't going to have another child because they didn't want to put that burden on society and themselves and cause economic problems and all this. And this is another case where when he gets arrested, they go to the police courts. He wouldn't take an oath on the Bible because he was a secularist, and he was Malthusian, and because she was too. Again, you have this idea, this look at them from the press, from the jury themselves of, well, you know, it's almost, there was a very confusion. It's like a satanic, like, what, they don't believe in God. There's this, what's this about Methuselah, you know, ending the population, holistic population control. And of course, again, it goes down a different path. And this is one of the cases where when they finally go to go to trial, they don't even bother pursuing it because maybe it's too difficult to pursue a trial to charge, you know, on a victim who's got that baggage.
Yeah.
All done. All righty, folks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. No.
No. Yeah, no women. Yeah.
All males.
Yeah, women didn't get on juries for a very long time. Yeah, this was well before that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there we go, folks. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tanya.
No, thank you.